Good morning, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed your coffee, the little break, and caught up with friends and all the news that has been happening during the morning. Welcome back. We are in our next plenary session entitled How to Make the Economic Model Fit the Planetary Boundaries. We all agree that something is off-key with the economic model that we are all living in. Somehow we feel uncomfortable that there is not a good fit, that we need to change something. But there doesn't seem to be an agreement what we need to change. But before we will go and discuss with our very interesting panelists who hopefully are going to challenge us also to revise our own thinking, I would like to pass the microphone to Jackie Davis, who is our team weaver, who will hopefully hold the whole conference together and remind us of what happened yesterday and what happened this morning. So Jackie, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Lena. And what I'm going to try and do for you is in just 4 to 5 minutes, give you a sense, highlight some of the key points, some of the answers to the key questions we're addressing that are emerging from the debates. On the question of why we need a new socio-ecological contract, speaker after speaker agreed that we are indeed at a turning point, as Philippe Pochet said at the opening of this conference, and that we need what Luca Vicentini and others described as a new paradigm for our economic model, and Rainer Hoffmann called a new relationship between the states and the markets, a new relationship that needs to be encapsulated in a new contract, or, to use Ursula von der Leyen's words, a new social rulebook. Because of the multiple challenges that face us, including the huge changes we're discussing required in our economies and societies to transition to a low-carbon future, widening inequalities, and the way in which the digital revolution is changing the way we live and work. All of this and much more means that the current rules, based on old realities, as was said yesterday, are no longer fit for purpose. And also because COVID has underlined the weaknesses of governments and public sectors and is challenging some of the dogmas of the traditional economic model and providing therefore a real opportunity for a new start. Quotes, to act boldly to build a totally different world, as Pepe Alvarez put it. Many speakers stressed that there is no going back to what they called the old normal post-COVID. So, as Mariana Mazzucato said, we must seize the moment to set the direction for change. But what should that direction be? As Lena was just indicating, we agree on the need for change. We don't always agree what change. So what should this reset include? Let me give you a sense of some of the answers that are emerging. Mariana called for a moonshot approach, with the public and private sectors coming together to deliver the deep change required, and with reaching the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 as the mission. It should focus on delivering a fair and just transition, which Commissioner Nicholas Schmidt told us this morning is fundamental to our democracies. And this just transition must be at the heart of the debate about how we create economic wealth and not be treated, as it is now, according to Mariana, as a peripheral issue. Indeed, speaker after speaker has repeatedly underlined that while the increased focus on the social dimension in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic is of course welcome, it must be translated into concrete actions, especially to tackle growing inequalities, which have been exacerbated by the pandemic, with the focus not on setting minimum social standards, but as Luca Vicentini and Plamen Dimitrov argued, on upward convergence. And as well as addressing the climate aspects of the just transition, we talked about that this morning, we also talked about the impacts of digitalization that also require urgent action, We have to rebuild our social system to ensure the new world of work is not a world without any social rights, said Commissioner Schmidt. And all of this needs to be backed by a massive programme of investment in modernising the economy to deliver the socio-ecological transition, including using the EU's recovery funds, but also going beyond that, and with strong positive conditionalities attached, not the negative ones, not the austerity conditionalities that followed the financial crisis a decade ago, but positive ones attached to the goals we want to reach. It also requires new indicators to measure progress going beyond GDP to, as Laurent Berger put it, act as a compass in ensuring that once the course is set, Europe stays on track to deliver the just transition. But finally, none of this can happen without the trade union movement and without social dialogue. For, as the Commission President herself put it, good policies that will stand the test of time can only be built through dialogue. And Mariana Mazzucato stressed that the mission approach that she champions must have trade unions at the centre. Governments, she said, are not doing their job, and trade unions are key in showing the direction to follow. Maria João Rodrigues echoed this. The role of trade unions is even more essential now in the context of this debate about the new paradigm. And many speakers, not just trade union leaders, but also Ursula von der Leyen herself stressed the importance of enhancing collective bargaining as part of this. Luca Vicentini said at the end of yesterday's discussions that trade unions often struggle to make sure that they are part of the public policy design process, although he said there has been some progress recently. The big question now is how to build on that. And I'm hoping we're going to hear some more answers to that over the course of the rest of our discussions. That's all from me for now. I'll be back at the end of the day with another report. But for now, back to you, Lina.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for reminding us all what happened yesterday and what kind of ideas were debated and put forward yesterday. But to our panelists now. First, we have Grace Blakely, who is an economics commentator at the Tribune magazine. Grace, you have been a very strong advocate for the Green Deal, new Green Deal, but you also argue that there needs to be considerable change and that we cannot go forward as before. But you also have made links between the 2008-2010 crisis and the bailouts of financial industry at the time and the current bailouts of industry, which in a way maintains and strengthens the monopoly capitalism. So how do you see, what should we do? What do we need to change in our economic model to make it different, to make it fit the planetary boundaries so that we remain healthy, that the planet can recover and remain healthy to also support us in the future?
Thanks very much. Thank you for that introduction. And yeah, I just want to say I'm really happy to be here first because I spend a huge amount of time giving talks, and a lot of the time I'm saying, you know, there are no individual solutions to collective challenges. So naturally, when I'm asked, you know, what can we do about things like climate change, I'm not saying recycle or use plastic straws. I'm always saying join a union. We need to strengthen the labor movement. We need to kind of build up this form of counterpower that is going to be critical for allowing us to tackle these problems. So it's really great to be in a space where we can kind of think through a little bit more deeply what that means, what it means to be able to kind of rebuild the power of working people today and how that can be used to develop and implement solutions to climate breakdown. But I want to talk a little bit about this question of kind of individual versus kind of collective solutions to climate change. And I talk about a bit about this in the book, The Corona Crash, because the individualistic understanding of climate change that we have was used directly by fossil fuel companies. In fact, BP itself came up with the idea of your carbon footprint. And they love this idea, of course, because it really completely relinquishes them of any responsibility for climate breakdown. One of my favorite examples of this at the moment, actually, and this kind of brings together so many trends that we're seeing in modern capitalism, so I really like this story, is there's an app called Vive, which you use to track your carbon footprint as you would track your steps or your sleep. And it's backed by, got seed capital from a subsidiary of BP called Launchpad, and its founder used to work for BP. And obviously all the fossil fuel companies are very much behind this idea that we'll solve climate breakdown if we all download an app on our phone, recycle, stop using plastic straws, and figure out exactly how to kind of reduce our own personal carbon footprint. So every time you take a flight, you also plant a tree via BP's handy little app. Meanwhile, 100 companies are responsible for 71% of all emissions. This is a stat we saw, I think it came out a year or 2 years ago. And economists frequently come back at this and say, oh, it's not the companies that are doing anything wrong. It's the people who are using the things that the companies are producing. And this is based on the kind of standard idea that we have within neoclassical economics, that companies don't really matter. They're just kind of production functions that are kind of automatically transforming inputs into outputs in response to price signals. So corporations don't really matter. We don't need to think about them that much. And yet, of course, one of the biggest challenges that we're facing today, as you know, many people will know, as many people will have spoken about already, I'm sure, is corporate power. And when it comes to climate breakdown, this is a really central issue because, and again, another really clarifying story is what happened that we're now slowly gaining an understanding of when ExxonMobil in the 1960s discovered that there was this effect when you burned fossil fuels that it called the greenhouse effect. Its scientists called the greenhouse effect. And it kind of took this scientific agenda forward somewhat for a decade or so before realizing, oh, wow, this is a big deal. So it slashed the funding for its research department, took that money and channeled it into climate change denialism and into various different kind of groups and initiatives that were aimed at casting doubt on the idea that burning fossil fuels was in any way linked to global warming. So clearly, corporate power matters, and this is going to be a really, really important part of determining how we develop solutions to climate breakdown. Often what we get at this point is the understanding that naturally the response to this problem should be, okay, well, we'll let the state fix it. And yet states seem intent on trying to fix this problem through the market. Again, this is this is a kind of logic that's been behind various different emissions trading schemes, including the EU's trading scheme, which, as I'm sure everyone here knows, was something of a, not a particularly successful example, at least initially, and was kind of slowly developed as it was realized that as a result of a huge amount of lobbying from many of these large companies, the price of carbon was, done in it was priced completely incorrectly. And actually many companies ended up making money from this without really substantially changing their behavior. Now, this is obviously, not a great example of state and international action to tackle climate breakdown. But in a way, I like it because it shows something that we should all know, which is that markets and prices aren't just a natural phenomenon. They're constructed by us through regulation, through laws, and certain actors have a huge amount of power to kind of influence those things within markets. And I think both of these issues, so this idea of, we can fix climate change through a carbon footprint or through just putting the right price on carbon, speak to the way in which we have this kind of fundamental misconception at the heart of the way we talk about the economy, which is the idea that politics and economics, states and markets are separate. Over here, we have politics. That's the realm of democracy. It's the realm of states where everyone's equal and we're able to kind of have a level of contestation and debate and discussion and conflict over the way that we want the future of society to go. But over here is the economy. is the market. No one has power here because we're all just firms, individual firms bumping up against one another in free markets, individual consumers doing the same sorts of things. And never the twain shall meet. It's very important to make sure that these two completely separate logics are kept completely separate. So if you want to fix a problem that's coming from within the market mechanism, you leave it to the market. If you want to fix a problem that seems to be coming from within the state, you fix it using politics. And yet this is so obviously not the right way to look at capitalism, and especially not when it comes to this question of climate breakdown, because economic actors have a huge amount of political power, and political actors consistently favor the interests of powerful economic actors when they're making their decisions. And this comes back, I think, to the point I was making it at the beginning, because, where is the actor that can step in to kind of deal with all this? We can't just rely on the state. Big business isn't just going to change itself. Marx famously said that the state is just a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie. And I think he'd probably have the same opinion about many of today's international institutions. I think this is a bit simplistic. In fact, what I see as the state, the way I conceptualize the state, is that it is a site of class struggle, just like the firm itself, which perhaps not today, but once was itself a site of class struggle. Action within the state helps to kind of coordinate and develop and implement a sense of class agency, and the implementation of policies and initiatives that push forward a set of class interests. And historically, this is where the labor movement came in. Not only was the labor movement able to bargain and negotiate at the level of the firm with, the intent of boosting wages or improving conditions, there was also a crucial role for the labor movement within the state and within our political institutions. Again, this was perhaps most prominent during a time where we didn't have such a rigid separation between these areas of the state and the market. There was an understanding that states do plan, that they act in markets, and that they construct markets, and that it made sense to have a relatively transparent process of contestation over how those rules would be made. So there was the labor movement that was able to lobby and act on behalf of its members and demand a particular set of policies that was going to not only benefit working people, but also actually give rise to a much more sustainable economic system than the one that we have today. And yet the labor movement has, over the last several decades, been beaten back in almost every state around the world. Now, of course, it is particularly bad in the UK, where I'm speaking from now, where the kind of model of using the state to actively kind of fight against and dismantle the labor movement was pioneered by Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. But this is true in many states all around the world, even in more social democratic European states, where the rights of unions have been reduced over successive years. And what do we see as a result of that? Well, a long-standing decline in the labour share of national income across most wealthy economies. So I think this kind of brings us back to this central question as to what is the agent, where is the agent that is going to act on behalf of the interests of the majority and really get to tackling this question of climate breakdown. And I think that is the central issue, is who's going to act on behalf of the interests of the majority, because there is a kind of minority solution to climate change. And it comes back to these questions of, track your carbon footprint using this app, and let's implement some emissions trading schemes. Because whilst it is true that climate breakdown affects all of us, it affects all of us unevenly, just like the pandemic, just like any event that takes place within a system in which there are kind of fundamentally unequal relations of power between different groups. And you can imagine a kind of status quo solution to climate breakdown. I'm not in the camp where I think there's no solution to climate breakdown within capitalism. I think there is a solution to climate breakdown within capitalism, but it would be governed by the logic of the system as it exists now, which means protect the interests of the powerful in parts of the world where power is concentrated, and leave the rest of the world where life is less valuable simply to kind of deal with the consequences on its own. And I think that is the danger that we're going to be seeing at the moment. We have, you know, in the absence of an actor that can really act on behalf of the interests of the majority, we see kind of fake right populist narratives saying, yes, climate change is with us. So what should we do? Well, put up much stronger borders and keep the rest of the world out as sea levels rise, as we start to see more extreme weather events, as desertification sets in. Clearly, you know, whilst this is conceivably to some people their version of a solution to climate breakdown, this is not a solution to climate breakdown that is going to support the interests of most people on the planet. And yeah, that is where I think the labour movement has to come in today. We have to be able to reimagine and reinvent the labour movement and the union movement, not simply as kind of the kind of corporatist relationship that we saw in the past, and equally not as the kind of individualistic relationship between unions and members that we see today. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but the most frequent contact I get from my union is asking me if I want a cheap deal on life insurance or something along those lines. I think the big unions could have a much greater role in actually coordinating their members so that we could, you know, really revive what was once a set of actors, a movement that did seek to constrain the ravages of capitalism, whether that was realized in inequality, in environmental breakdown, in you know, various different kinds of crises that emerge from capitalism. And yes, start to kind of coordinate members in order to agitate for the kind of social change that we do need to tackle capitalism. And that is really, I think, the only place that energy and that activism is going to come from. And I hope, you know, I'm probably over time now, so I don't want to spend too much more time talking about what this might look like, although I recognize that is probably the most important question is how do we do all this? How do we ensure that the labour movement is providing political education for its members, is providing avenues for direct action, for organising, for agitating to deliver this kind of change? And also, how can we make sure that unions are able to have the kinds of deep embedded relationship with both political parties and state institutions that was once that, you know, they once did. Certainly in the UK, that's a relationship that's been challenged quite substantially, not just over the last 40 years, but even more recently with the kind of changing priorities of the Labour Party. So clearly we have a lot of questions to answer as to how this model can be implemented. But I really do think that the solutions that have been developed so far based on one of these two logics, which is either it's all up to individuals or it's all up to the market, is not going to generate a sustainable solution to climate breakdown that actually reduces and alleviates inequality and all the other various deep-rooted challenges and problems that we are seeing brought to the surface in our societies during the pandemic. Instead, a kind of market-based, individualized solution to climate change that we might see if, you know, we aren't able to implement this model would actually deepen and worsen many of those challenges. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Grace. So here we are. You put forward even more questions than we had before. There is a lot of need for taking our thinking forward. But I think we are still facing the problem. We all talk about the Green Deal. So it's a deal between whom? And I know our next speaker, Anne Pettifor, who is a political economist, an author, and public speaker. And she has written about the new Green Deal. And in one of your recent books, you put forward arguments about its affordability. But before you talk about your ideas, maybe I could ask you, who is the deal between, who are the parties to the deal? Because if you follow the economic model, the thinking of the way our society functions, how the economy functions, if you're talking about the deal, there are parties to the deal. So who are these parties?
Lena, thank you ever so much. That's a very, very important question. And I am going to deal with it. I want to, first of all, thank you again for having me here. I'm also, like Grace, very chuffed to be part of this conversation. And can I say how impressed I am by Jackie, the theme weaver, and by the very idea of having a theme weaver. I think that's extremely helpful. And so let me go straight away to your question. What is the Green New Deal? What is the deal? Who were the parties to the Green New Deal? And for me, it is straightforward. It's straightforward. The two parties to the deal are society, represented by the state on the one hand, and the finance sector on the other, represented by, I would say, Wall Street and the City of London. That's the deal. If you don't agree a deal between those two parties, and if that deal doesn't satisfy the interests of society, then there is no hope for tackling what is the biggest threat that we're facing, which is climate breakdown and biodiversity collapse. Now, Jackie excellently summarized what was said yesterday. And can I say, and perhaps be quite brutal about this, that a lot of what Jackie reported to us is actually delusional. The idea that we can talk about dialogue between the public and the private sectors, and that we can talk about the public and the private sector working together to develop a strategy, as Mariana Mazzucato suggests, is, in my view, utterly delusional. And the reason why is this. The finance sector, as represented by Wall Street and the City of London and Frankfurt, is immensely powerful. They make all the decisions. They call all the shots. And if you doubt that, then all you have to do is read John Kerry's statement to the media last week when he launched, as Joe Biden's climate envoy, he launched the climate plan, the Biden climate plan. And in that, all that he could really do was say, we appeal to Wall Street to finance this stuff. We're thrilled by what Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, is saying. He's saying that they're now going to go green. Isn't this wonderful? And now he appealed very directly to asset managers, vulture funds, hedge funds on Wall Street to come forward and help deliver the climate plan. Now, there can be nothing more delusional than the idea that Wall Street, the City of London and Frankfurt are concerned about climate breakdown and the need to transform the ecosystem. They're not. They don't care a damn. And the fact is that they have huge power, and they know they have huge power because we have conceded, by we, I mean governments like that of John Kerry, have conceded that power to them. We've handed it over to them. We're asking BlackRock to implement the Green New Deal, or at least the Americans are. And in Europe, in the Green Deal, the European Commission is also appealing to BlackRock to implement the Green Deal. Now, there is no way that we can trust these centers of financial power to address the huge threat that faces us. And what I got from Jackie's summary of yesterday's discussion is a sense that actually the situation is not urgent. It is incredibly urgent. You know, human civilization here is at stake for two reasons. Let me just give two examples. One, the experts are telling us that this pandemic is not the big one, that there are more pandemics in the pipeline. And that's perfectly logical, because the more we as human beings invade wildlife territory, the more likely are we to be able to import their viruses, right? And we're doing that ruthlessly and brutally, financed by Wall Street and the City of London and Frankfurt, right? So that means that the threat of future pandemics is very real. But the other big threat is ocean warming. And we don't talk about that enough. We talk about climate warming. Actually, the real threat is ocean warming, because all of our huge cities, Shanghai, New York, London, are on the borders of the sea, right? And the seas are rising. And we you know, a scientist spoke the other day about the threat of this great monster inside the oceans that's going to rise up. So we just have to have another Hurricane Sandy on a more dramatic scale than we had a few years ago. And New York could be wiped out. And you know, we know that Hurricane Sandy did huge damage, for example, to the energy systems of New York, which are the things that drive economic activity. So these are very urgent threats. We cannot mess around and talk about, you know, having dialogue between, you know, these market players and states. And the reason that I think it's delusional is because, as I say, they have enormous power. They have the power to determine the exchange rate of a nation state. They have the power to, you know, ensure that central banks provide them with the liquidity when they need it. And if central banks don't come to their rescue, they threaten systemic failure of the whole economy, as they did in 2008 and as they did again in March last year. They have the power to decide whether or not capital flows into Europe for the Green Deal, or whether instead it flows out to somewhere where it can earn higher rates of return, right? That's a power that is beyond the power of the state. And that is only beyond the power of the state because the state has conceded that power in the way that John Kerry last week conceded that it was up to Wall Street to decide whether or not the new administration could create what they call good paying union jobs. The idea that Wall Street wants to create good paying union jobs in the United States when actually it can get by with exploitative rates of pay in non-union economies around the world is delusional, right? And it explains the collapse of social democracy across Europe, but also in the United States. Biden's administration is hanging by a thread. In 2 years' time, there are congressional elections. And if Biden doesn't deliver for the people of the United States decent, you know, union jobs, then there's a good chance they're going to lose because there are 74 million people who voted for Trump. So we know there's a really big threats facing us and we can't mess around. Now, the question is, come back to you, Lena, is what is the deal between the two of us? Well, I think the deal is this, that the finance sector depends utterly and completely on taxpayers, on our public institutions for its power. Let me give you an example. Debt, a government bond, a US Treasury bill, a British gilt is the very, very fundamental plumbing of the private finance sector. It is collateral. It is an asset, and it is the most valuable collateral in the world. It's far more valuable than property, works of art, racehorses, all the other kinds of assets that the finance sector so loves to extract rent from. So this is our asset. We issue bonds, our government spends, and this creates an asset called debt, which the finance sector then uses to put onto its own balance sheets. It buys a government bond and it uses that bond to leverage additional finance. It's like if you want a mortgage, if you've got a property, an asset, you could go to the bank and say, look, my property has risen in value, and can I borrow more? Can I have another big mortgage against this property because it's increased? And the bank says, well, you've got this collateral, which is a decent property, I'll lend you money. Now, the debt is the collateral on which the whole of the private finance sector, Wall Street, City of London, and Frankfurt depend. But it's our asset. The reason why it is valuable, the reason why it is collateral, is because behind the Bank of England, behind the Treasury, are, in our case, about 30 million taxpayers. In Europe, behind the ECB, behind the Commission, I don't know, is it 120 million taxpayers? And these are people who regularly pay their taxes, who will go on paying taxes in Britain for the next 100 years, as they have done for the last 100 years, right? That's what makes this collateral so valuable. And yet we give this to the private finance sector. And we say, help yourself, right? Here it is. And the terms and conditions on which you can obtain this collateral, it's entirely for you or the market to determine, right? I think we should be arguing, no, this asset is a public asset. It's publicly created. If you, BlackRock, you've got $8.6 trillion in your account, and you're really worried about what's going to happen to that cash, because you can't put that cash in a bank, a high street bank. It's not safe there because the government guarantee doesn't cover $8.6 trillion. So what are you doing? You're exchanging that cash, if you're BlackRock, for this wonderful asset called public debt, which is European debt, British debt, and most importantly, and the most valuable is US debt, because they have even more taxpayers than the rest of us. So why don't we say you can use this asset, but these are the terms and conditions. Thou shalt invest in our green economy. Thou shalt create jobs that are decent union paying, good paying union jobs. Thou shalt stop exploiting the fossil fuels. Thou shalt stop lending to fossil fuel companies. You know, since the Paris Agreement, American banks, Wall Street banks, have lent huge sums of money to the fossil fuel industry, and it's incredibly profitable. So, you know, one of the terms and conditions should be, in this relationship, in this New Deal, must be that thou shalt not use your lending powers, which actually, by the way, you only have those lending powers because you're backed by the state, to fuel fossil fuels. And the reason why this is so important, and the reason why, Lena, we call it the Green New Deal, is because it's modeled on Roosevelt's New Deal. And on the night that Roosevelt was inaugurated as president, he'd made a speech, by the way, in which he'd condemned Wall Street. And he'd condemned the fact that all they could offer wasn't, you know, to deal with the real economy, but just by creating more credit. That's all they could offer, was more credit. He made this powerful speech attacking Wall Street. And on the night of his inauguration, he demanded that the American Treasury should begin to withdraw the United States from the gold standard. And the gold standard at the time was our kind of globalization of finance. It was the thing that enabled Wall Street to move around the world and determine interest rates and exchange rates and run the economy, essentially. And Roosevelt said no. And his Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, wrote in his memoirs that what he and Roosevelt had done was to move the government from Wall Street and into a democratically elected government's treasury in Washington. And that power, that move, was done because Roosevelt and his team were very clear that one of the reasons they couldn't tackle their ecological crisis, which at the time was the Dust Bowl, was because to raise the finance, government had to genuflect to Wall Street, had to pay the price of money that Wall Street determined, right? And he said, no, 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 no. We have a democratic mandate, and we are going to determine, you know, the exchange rate and the interest rate and where money goes, because we want to create jobs, because you, Wall Street, have created massive unemployment, and you cannot and you have not been able to address this big ecological crisis we face, which was the Dust Bowl. That's why it's called the Green New Deal. And I'm very struck that Mrs. van Leeuwen doesn't call it that in Europe. She calls it the Green Deal. And that's partly because the European Commission does not want that deal to be done, right? There isn't a demand, and it's not coming from the social democratic parties. It's not coming from the left. It's not even really coming from the trade unions. The demand that other party to the deal should be subordinated and made servant to the economy and servant to the transformation of the ecosystem. They should be there to serve us for that purpose, not to be masters of the economy. So that is the deal, Lena. And, you know, we've got to strike that deal, and we have to understand our power in striking that deal, our power in relation to finance, because without taxpayers, without public institutions, without a publicly backed central bank, they would be nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before you go and listen to the others, I have a question to you from Frederick. And he's asking whether we can set the financial transaction or impose a tax, not necessarily financial transaction tax, but to impose a tax to finance the social Green Deal.
Yeah.
If you can just very shortly kind of give what's your thoughts are on
First
this.
of all, I just want to make very clear that we don't need to raise taxes to pay for the Green New Deal, because we can do what we've done in the great financial crisis and in a pandemic. We can use the central bank to generate the finance we need to finance the Green New Deal. Taxes are a consequence at home. They are a consequence, because when you invest, for example, in creating jobs, and creating jobs is going to be, shifting the economy from fossil fuels to sustainability requires moving from fossil fuels to labor. We're going to have to grow our own green beans, if you like. That, if we create jobs, that'll generate the tax revenues that can be used for repaying the borrowing. But he's absolutely right, Frederick, that what we can also do is tax flows of capital as they come across borders, cross-border flows. And, we can do that in lots of ways. Here in Britain, we've done it by, for example, putting a tax on people who buy, foreigners who buy property here. And that helped to cool the property market in London. So there are ways in which we can tax those flows of capital, but they are a consequence. They will be a consequence, if you like, of our investment in jobs, in good paying union jobs, which will generate tax revenues, which will help to pay for the borrowing in the first instance. Sorry, is that too long an answer?
Thank you. No, that's perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. Stay listening with us, because we have, hopefully we will have time for questions and answers at the end also. But our next speaker is Aurore Laluc, who is a member of the European Parliament from France. She belongs to the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament. Aurore, I know that you are active in the Economic Committee in the European Parliament, and you are also active in the subcommittee, or newly created subcommittee on tax issues. I know you also have written, before you become to the European Parliament, you have written several texts on financialization. So for you, what is your take? How do we, when we are talking about the economic models, when we are talking about fitting the economic models to our modern life, to take it forward in a way that doesn't destroy the planet for the future? So please tell us, what is your take and understanding of the climate emergency that we are facing?
Je vais parler en français. Bonjour,
Okay.
bonjour tout le monde. J'ai eu très très peur parce que mon Wi-Fi s'est déconnecté. J'ai eu le bonheur quand même d'entendre la grande partie du discours d'Anne Petitfort. Et c'est un bonheur, à vrai dire, de vous entendre tous et toutes. Et je suis extrêmement honorée d'être dans un panel avec des gens qui ont fait beaucoup pour faire avancer le débat vers justement un nouveau contrat social et écologique, et avec un niveau d'expertise très grand. Donc voilà, je suis très honorée et très heureuse, et j'aimerais finalement être avec vous tous tout le temps au Parlement européen. Si je pouvais nous transposer tous ensemble au Parlement européen, je le ferais avec grand plaisir. Alors, pour répondre à ce qui a été dit, je crois qu'on est rentré, je veux dire, des banalités, mais n'empêche que ces banalités ne se traduisent toujours pas par des politiques publiques conséquentes aujourd'hui. On est rentré, à mon avis, dans un nouveau siècle qui a commencé l'année dernière, et qui a commencé d'ailleurs par quelque chose qu'on a oublié avec la pandémie, qui était quand même des feux gigantesques qu'on n'arrivait plus à maîtriser, qu'on n'arrivait plus à éteindre, qui s'est poursuivi par cette pandémie, qui s'est poursuivi par un été sibérien de plus de 30 degrés, quelque chose d'assez incroyable. Et en fait, on a une nouvelle donne environnementale, qui est que l'environnement ne nous suit plus finalement dans notre démesure, et que nous avons créé un environnement d'incertitude radicale finalement, au point que c'est même pas notre modèle de croissance qui est remis en cause, c'est même pas notre économie, c'est même pas notre modèle social, c'est même notre socialisation finalement, parce qu'on s'est tous retrouvés, des milliards d'entre nous, enfermés chez nous, et c'est notre liberté et notre socialisation qui ont finalement été profondément remises en cause. La question est de savoir maintenant quelles sont les leçons que l'on tire de tout ça. Est-ce qu'on tire les bonnes leçons et qu'on sort de cette crise par le haut, ou est-ce que finalement non, on continue comme avant? Et force est de constater, et moi ce qui m'inquiète particulièrement, c'est que cette crise vient de Wuhan, qui est un modèle de développement finalement très caricatural dans sa façon, dans sa relation avec la nature. Il n'est absolument pas en symbiose avec la nature, il est vraiment en parasite finalement avec la nature, et cette espèce d'agglomération géante a grandi en détruisant finalement l'écosystème qui le soutenait. Et en fait, au lieu de se dire que le modèle de développement de ce type conduit à sa propre perte, nous, en tant qu'Européens, on est en train de regarder la Chine et se dire « Oh là là, on est en train de perdre la course économique et la course politique ». On regarde les États-Unis et on se dit exactement la même chose, alors que ce sont des modèles qui, de facto, vont droit dans le mur et qui courent à leur propre perte et qui surtout courent à notre perte. Ça, c'est un premier point. Et en fait, face à cette crise, on se dit eh bien, on va faire tout ce qu'il faut, quoi qu'il en coûte. Quoi qu'il en coûte est un quoi qu'il en coûte financier. Et on ne se rend pas compte que c'est un quoi qu'il en coûte environnemental aussi. C'est-à-dire qu'on veut absolument maintenir, coûte que coûte, un modèle de production, de consommation et d'échange qui est en fait mort. Parce que tout simplement, l'écosystème, la planète, est en train de nous dire qu'elle ne peut plus le soutenir. Donc, de facto, ce modèle n'existe plus en fait dans la réalité. Mais nous faisons tout, nous mettons tous nos moyens, toutes nos finances, même au point des fois de détricoter nos modèles sociaux pour pouvoir absolument le maintenir en vie. Et je trouve que c'est très interrogeant sur notre continent européen, parce qu'on est un continent qui a été capable du pire, il ne faut évidemment pas l'oublier, mais qui est aussi un continent qui est censé être celui des lumières, de la rationalité. Alors Dieu sait que nous, Français, on aime énormément vanter notre mérite dans ce domaine et nous survendre, mais c'est vrai qu'on était quand même un continent où il y avait des philosophes de la raison. Et là, aujourd'hui, nous ne sommes plus dans la raison, en fait. C'est-à-dire qu'on refuse de regarder la réalité scientifique telle qu'elle est, on refuse de regarder le monde tel qu'il est, et on essaye absolument de faire rentrer la réalité scientifique dans finalement ce qui est une certaine forme d'irrationalité, et je serais même tentée de dire une certaine forme de religion. Nous ne sommes plus rationnels finalement. On refuse la rationalité, et alors qu'on a vu que notre système venait tout simplement de s'effondrer. Donc maintenant, la question est de savoir comment on remet l'économie à sa place, et pas uniquement d'un point de vue des frontières planétaires, mais aussi tout simplement d'un point de vue politique, en fait. C'est-à-dire que là où on a eu des avancées intéressantes en matière économique, c'est quand on avait des leaders politiques qui étaient en capacité de se dire « Voici quel est mon objectif politique, et en fonction de ça, je dessine un système économique ». Et aujourd'hui, on a une espèce d'adaptation permanente finalement à ce qui fait bien finalement. Qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire pour faire de l'économie à peu près sérieusement, avec des codes qui sont des codes, ma foi, totalement faux. Donc, une fois qu'on a regardé ça, la question est de savoir non pas comment on adapte notre modèle de croissance, mais comment on remet réellement l'économie à sa place. Ça passe, à mon avis, et ça a été en partie mentionné, notamment dans le résumé, premièrement, par une question des indicateurs. La question des indicateurs peut paraître une question à la fois très technique et à la fois un peu anecdotique, comme ça. Elle est en fait déterminante. Elle est déterminante. Parce que si on n'a pas, et si moi, en tant que décideur politique, je n'ai pas les bons indicateurs, je ne peux pas savoir si les politiques que nous menons vont dans le bon sens ou pas, tout simplement. Et si vous voulez, on a besoin de savoir si on va dans le bon sens du côté de la soutenabilité de la biodiversité, du côté des émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Est-ce qu'on va dans le bon sens du côté des inégalités et de la pauvreté? Et l'indicateur PIB, il ne peut rien nous dire de cela. Il peut juste rien nous dire de cela. Ce n'est pas son rôle. Il n'a pas été créé pour ça. Il arrive dans les années 30 sous Roosevelt à un moment spécifique, qui est celui de relancer une économie. Il arrive dans mon pays, la France, en 1944, au moment de la reconstruction, c'est-à-dire au moment où il y a un besoin de développement matériel. Et il arrive pour voir si les politiques économiques, si les politiques publiques fonctionnent. Aujourd'hui, est-ce que notre urgence, c'est de faire du développement matériel? Je ne pense pas. Vu la pandémie et vu le nombre de pandémies, comme Anne a parfaitement dit, que nous allons avoir prochainement, ce n'est pas ça l'urgence. L'urgence est de savoir comment on fait pour mettre notre économie dans le respect des limites de la biosphère et pour faire en sorte qu'on redistribue mieux les richesses. Parce qu'en fait, au bout d'un moment, quand on a tout, le problème n'est pas d'avoir plus, le problème est d'avoir mieux et surtout de mieux redistribuer les richesses. Donc, on a besoin à ce stade de réformes dans ce sens. Au niveau européen, ça se traduit concrètement par quoi? Ça se traduit par le semestre européen et sa réforme. Ce n'est pas à vous que je vais apprendre que le semestre européen est là pour coordonner les politiques économiques au niveau européen. Le problème, c'est que ça se fait sur une base qui est une base uniquement dite économique, ça ne prend pas forcément en compte l'environnement ni la question du social, et en plus, ça se fait avec un logiciel qui est un logiciel dit néolibéral, où la dette publique est la mère de tous les problèmes. Voilà, donc ça ne prend pas non plus vraiment en compte la question de la dette privée, etc. Donc ça passe par ça au niveau européen. La première étape est de faire cette réforme du semestre européen, et ça bloque, et j'en sais quelque chose ayant été rapportrice sur le sujet, c'est-à-dire qu'on n'arrive plus à avoir une majorité au Parlement européen sur cette question-là. Il y a un vrai clivage gauche-droite et qui, à mon avis, est un bon clivage. Voilà, parce qu'on met au cœur du débat les vrais enjeux. Ça, c'est un premier point, la question des indicateurs. L'autre point, c'est celui, effectivement, qui a été aussi développé par Anne, qui est la question de la régulation bancaire et financière. La question de la monnaie aussi. C'est-à-dire qu'on ne peut pas avoir une économie qui fonctionne correctement si la sphère financière a des moyens financiers bien supérieurs à ceux de l'économie réelle. Ce n'est pas possible. Et je trouve que là, on mériterait justement de redevenir keynésien au sens de Keynes de Bretton Woods, c'est-à-dire de se dire que la finance et la monnaie sont là pour servir des politiques économiques, qui sont là pour servir des politiques sociales et qui sont là pour servir des enjeux politiques qui sont ceux d'ailleurs tout simplement de la paix. Voilà. Et la paix n'est pas un petit enjeu, contrairement à ce qu'on raconte. Il y a des vrais soucis de conflit aujourd'hui au niveau mondial, mais aussi au sein de nos sociétés, tout simplement. Donc, pour pouvoir faire ça, il nous faudra à un moment reposer la question du système monétaire et financier international. Il va nous falloir à un moment reposer une question taboue, qui est celle de la mobilité des capitaux. À partir du moment où on a une parfaite mobilité des capitaux au niveau mondial, on le sait, les économistes sérieux le savent parfaitement, ça veut dire qu'on met en concurrence automatiquement nos modèles sociaux. Et ça, c'est un moment, ça va être un sujet qu'il va falloir remettre sur la table, la question de la mobilité des capitaux. Est-ce qu'on veut des capitaux mobiles ou est-ce qu'on veut des modèles sociaux qui nous permettent d'avoir une prospérité et si possible une prospérité sans croissance, dont Tim Jackson parlera à mon avis 100 000 fois mieux que moi. Ça, c'est un vrai sujet. Comment on fait aussi pour faire en sorte qu'on ait des banques moins importantes? On a des banques beaucoup trop grosses. Et au niveau européen, et là, je vais parler aussi de mon pays, qui est celui de la France. Anne a mentionné l'Allemagne et a mentionné Londres. Il y a un vrai sujet qui est un sujet français. Pourquoi a-t-on des banques aussi importantes en France? On a des banques qui sont de la taille quasiment de certaines banques américaines. On n'a pas besoin d'autant de finances. Et là, il y a effectivement un problème de l'ordre du privé, avec beaucoup de lobbies bancaires, c'est vrai, mais derrière les lobbies bancaires, moi, je trouve exactement les mêmes éléments de langage dans la bouche des gouvernements français que dans la bouche des lobbies bancaires français. Voilà. C'est-à-dire qu'on a un vrai sujet. Il va falloir aujourd'hui faire en sorte que la régulation bancaire se fasse vraiment au niveau européen pour casser ce lien entre les pays qui défendent leurs champions nationaux. L'Allemagne défend sa Deutsche Bank et nous, on défend BNP Paribas et la Société Générale. Et ce n'est plus possible. Voilà, tout simplement. Il va falloir aussi refaire de l'économie pour de vrai, tout simplement. De la macroéconomie pour de vrai. Et au niveau européen, c'est particulièrement manifeste. On a une zone euro qui a été créée sans budget, sans fiscalité et sans même vraiment politique monétaire, ce qui est un exploit d'un point de vue pragmatique. C'est-à-dire que franchement, vous montrez ça sur un papier à n'importe quel économiste, il vous dit c'est pas possible, ça n'existe pas. Eh bien si, ça existe et on l'a fait. Voilà. Mais le problème, c'est que si on veut sortir à un moment de cette crise et si on veut sauver correctement les Européens, il va falloir un budget conséquent. Et c'est toujours pas fait. Il nous va falloir une vraie fiscalité et qu'on arrête de faire de la concurrence fiscale entre les pays, parce que si on n'a pas de justice fiscale, on n'aura jamais de justice sociale. Et là, par contre, il y a des enjeux très intéressants qui sont en train de se passer au niveau européen. Et je trouve que ça avance pour le coup dans le bon sens, notamment avec la réforme de l'OCDE, et c'est un vrai enjeu. Et à un moment, il va falloir aussi parler de la politique monétaire. Parce que la réalité, c'est quoi? Et Anne l'a parfaitement décrit, ce n'est pas possible de passer par les marchés financiers en permanence. Parce que derrière, on a finalement les États qui viendront payer et on a finalement les contribuables qui viendront payer. Et je vais dire quelque chose de caricatural, mais qui est la réalité. À chaque fois, c'est la même chose. C'est privatisation des profits et mutualisation des pertes. C'est aussi bête que ça. On est dans du rapport de force total et ce n'est pas admissible dans nos démocraties. Et par ailleurs, si on veut à un moment lutter contre la montée des populismes en Europe, il va falloir aussi regarder de très près ce genre de questions parce que c'est fondamentalement injuste en fait. Et donc revenir sur certains dogmes qui est le fait qu'une banque centrale doit avoir le droit, dans des moments exceptionnels, et nous vivons un moment exceptionnel, de financer les États, tout simplement. Il y a un moment où il va falloir choisir entre est-ce qu'on préfère s'accrocher à certains dogmes ou en fait faire de l'économie pour de vrai, faire de la politique pour de vrai et sauver un petit peu tout le monde. Là, la Banque centrale européenne a vraiment un rôle clé dans la crise que nous traversons aujourd'hui. Nous sommes plusieurs économistes à avoir appelé à l'annulation d'une partie des créances détenues par la Banque centrale européenne. Si on a fait cette proposition-là, ce n'est pas parce qu'à la base, on est pour l'annulation de la dette. Je ne suis pas pour du tout l'annulation des dettes à la base, mais c'est parce qu'en fait, on n'a tellement pas d'outils macroéconomiques au niveau européen que c'est le seul qu'on avait trouvé pour pouvoir donner un peu de lest aux États et qu'ils puissent investir parce qu'on a un gros problème. Et là, j'en viens à un problème économique et à un problème social. On a un gros problème d'investissement dans la zone européenne. J'ai peut-être été trop longue, pardon, vous me dites si je le suis. On a un gros sujet d'investissement au niveau européen et il faudra un moment investir dans la transition écologique. Je m'arrête là si j'ai été trop longue, toutes mes excuses. C'était juste pour vous dire qu'il n'y a que des solutions en fait, à la crise que nous traversons. Mais le plus gros problème, c'est de changer de lunettes. Si on change de lunettes, on voit qu'il n'y a que des solutions.
Great, great. Thank you very much, Aurore. We had compliments from our listeners that we have women-dominated panel today. And there is also a question that I will come back to you, just if you can give a sort of very brief reply. The question comes from Sarah, and she's asking, can the Green Deal be an impetus for addressing existing gender inequalities? So it's a tricky question, I realize. There is a link between many elements, but this is a gender. And maybe if you could just keep it in mind, and when we come to the question and answers session, maybe you could address it there. So thank you very much. But I would like to now move to our last speaker in our panel, Tim Jackson, who is an ecological economist and professor of sustainable development at the University of Surrey. And he has worked for years at the international level on sustainable consumption and production. Tim Aurore has just kind of posed a dilemma. Do we stick to the dogma, or are we going to be pragmatic? And she also referred to one of your main topics that you have been researching and writing about is precisely how can we have the kind of society without growth? How can we move away from this growth, GDP growth driven idea? How do we actually convince the politicians, the financial sector, the big business, the whole society that growth is not the panacea, that we can guarantee the well-being without having this old dogma of constant GDP growth? Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lena. And thank you for inviting me. It's a huge pleasure to be here, particularly on a panel that's dominated by women, as the congratulatory comment was made. And I think your question actually, your question to Aurora about, and to Anne about the gender contribution of a Green New Deal is a really important one, and it's one that I want to touch on a little bit, by way, I suppose, of trying to draw together some of the threads of the previous speakers, and also by way of situating our discussion here in the light of the experience of the last year or so. So it seems as though, listening to the other speakers this morning, that we're all pretty much agreed, actually, that there's a dysfunctionality at the heart of the relationship between society, and in particular between society and the financial sector. And we're also agreed that that is largely a kind of ideological distinction, that we are looking, as Aurora said, through the wrong glasses at the problems that we're facing, and that suggests that we are therefore to some extent beholden to certain belief systems about how the economy should work and how the finance system should work and what money is, and where debt exists and who has actually the access to the assets that Anne was talking about, created by public debt in particular, and that those are distinctly ideological positions, and therefore we're drawn, I think, very much back to Grace's question at the beginning about the nature of the state, and I want to come back to that a little bit at the end. I want to come back to just question whether the framing of the state as the site of class struggle is correct, and if it is correct, then how should we approach what actually seems to be a deep question of governance and a deep question of political change, concerning which we saw in 2019 particularly some really interesting initiatives that came from a different place in relation to the governance of climate change in particular. And I'm referring, of course, to Extinction Rebellion, to Fridays for the Future, to a set of popular social movements on the street that constitute a form of political participation that reached a degree of importance, I think, in the climate change debate that it hadn't reached before. And so it pushes us back, I think, to the very old questions about the relationship between the state and civil society, which hasn't been mentioned so much today. So we have state and market, of course, but civil society actually is an important arena for action. And part of civil society is the work and the interests of trade unions, which makes this very particularly appropriate that we're talking about these questions in the context of the trade unions. Let me go back a step though and ask, what are the lessons that we learned over this last year? And I think to answer your question, Lena, about the relationship between prosperity and growth, we learned something very fundamental, particularly at the height of the first wave of the pandemic, or as that pandemic was beginning to be visible. And we learned actually that prosperity is as much about health as it is about growth. And we also learned that in the face of a threat to that genuine prosperity, governments not only were in theory prepared to act, but they actually did act in quite dramatic ways to protect that form of prosperity, to protect health. And I want to just pick up on that analogy a little bit, because it seems to me that when you understand that moment in history where government turned round in the face of a global pandemic and said, our priority here is to protect health and life, they chose that priority over the growth of the economy, and they did it very deliberately. Some did it sooner, some did it later. Those who did it later were generally punished for doing it later. But it was a very deliberate choice, and it was, in a sense, the glasses that Aurora was asking us to search for, a different pair of glasses. We're looking at the problems we're facing, and we're not blinded anymore by the lenses that tell us that growth is the be-all and end-all of prosperity. We actually see what Thomas Jefferson wrote almost 2 centuries ago, that the care of human life and happiness, and not its destruction, is the first and only task of government. In other words, the reality of that moment when governments did something different should be a source of enormous hope to us, in the sense that we saw what was possible and we actually did it. In the face of doing it, and I don't by any means mean to trivialize some of the drastic consequences of the lockdown, and in particular of the economic impacts of the lockdown. But in thinking through the dynamics of that moment, it seems to me there are also lessons to be learned. And the first one of those lessons is around livelihoods, people's livelihoods, and the work that is done in society to support those livelihoods. And of course, the lockdown was first and most immediately a threat to people's livelihoods. But it was also a moment where we understand which livelihoods, which elements of work in society were the most important. We learned immediately the importance of care as a part of society. Care is what delivers us the health that was threatened by the pandemic. And yet we also learned that the people who were at the heart of that care system had been the most neglected for the longest time in the past. We also learned that those who are providing basic tasks of maintenance in society were incredibly important. Cleanliness became one of the most important things in the world during a pandemic that spread by a viral infection. And yet those people too had been, if you like, part of what Guy Standing calls the precariat. They had been the people with the least security in society, who were unable actually often to maintain secure livelihoods, had no prospects of decent pensions, and whose conditions of living were the worst in society. We were being given an object lesson that we had treated work and workers badly, and in particular, that we had treated that sector of work that represents care very badly. And this, of course, is a gendered question. And it is, in a sense, that answer to Lena's question to Anne at the beginning. Namely, is there a sense in which the Green New Deal should be supporting women, should be supporting and reducing that gender inequality? And I think it clearly is, because all of the statistics show that that sector of work and maintenance of society and cleanliness and care actually is mainly the work of women, has traditionally been the work of women in society, and it remains so in the future. And so there is there an obvious sense in which, in supporting that sector, we are reducing gender inequality. But is that the Green New Deal that we're talking about? Often it's not. Most of the time what we're talking about, thinking about in the sense of a Green New Deal, actually, and this goes to Anne's point specifically of Biden handing over the reins of a Green New Deal to a private sector that sees huge capital investment in new technology. Often that's the way the Green New Deal is seen. But in the context of the pandemic and the kind of society that we need, I think that's wrong. I think it's wrong to ask about green jobs and green skills as simply being about those jobs in photovoltaics or even in fact in energy efficiency technologies, in bits of kit that are sold on big capital markets. That is a part of where those jobs lie, but that is not really a green jobs strategy for a world in which we have systematically degraded the greenest jobs of all. And those greenest jobs are the jobs that exist in service-based sectors, where actually the value in those sectors is the time that people put in the service of each other. And that time is a commodity that cannot, in fact, be squeezed in the way that capitalism attempts to squeeze it, to ask our teachers to teach more and more children, to ask our nurses to care for more and more patients. Even in fact, in industries that can contribute to our quality of life, such as the leisure industry or the arts industry, to ask the London Philharmonic to play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony faster and faster each year, does not fit into the logic of capitalism, that logic of squeezing labor out of markets, the logic of squeezing labor out of our lives, and in the process, delegating the tasks that are most important to society to peoples whose livelihoods are threatened constantly by insecurity, low wages, poor working conditions. Now that it seems to me is, if you like, the most fundamental revelation of the last year, is how systematically that most important sector of work has been made most precarious over 2 or 3 centuries. And I think we should be in no doubt that the difficulty and the reasons for that sit at the heart of capitalism itself. They sit in the relentless pursuit of labor productivity, which in itself is the foundation for growth in society. And that relentless pursuit of labor productivity creates real differentials between the wages of those who are most important in society and those who are extracting rents from capital investment in sectors that are supported by the government pledge to value public debt, as Anne has said. So very, very briefly, I want to come back to the idea of the state and the question of whether it is the site of a class struggle, as Grace indicated it was at the beginning. And I think in a way, it's an insightful way of thinking about the difficulties of the state. But it does also tend to push us into a corner of arguing that in fact, the only way, because the market has stopped functioning and the state has become a site of class struggle, the only way to change anything is actually through some form of civil disobedience. And that may well be correct place to be, but I think it's really important, and I would argue strongly for this, that in the process of recognizing the importance of civil disobedience in the role of change, that we don't neglect Thomas Jefferson's idea of the state, that the care of human life and happiness is and not their destruction, is the first and only role of the state. And that vision of the state, I believe, is one that Europe in particular is capable of representing to an international stage. I'm less optimistic about my own country's ability to represent that vision just at the moment. But I do thoroughly stand by the experience and the history of Europe in doing so.
Thank you very much, Tim. I was reflecting when you were talking about the lessons that we learned from the crisis from last year. And because I'm in my everyday work, I follow also the European semester process, which is the economic governance process that Aurore referred to. And unfortunately, already now, we haven't really reached the end or the extent of the crisis. We haven't seen the real extent. We still don't know how long it will continue. But we already hear voices that are saying that this infamous Stability and Growth Pact that has handcuffed many member states when they have wanted to invest money in care, in education, in the well-being of their citizens. But because of the conditions that are there in the pact have limited them and stopped them. It has been suspended for the crisis so that we can put out precisely this sudden change in the thinking and behavior of the governments. But we already hear voices that are saying that we need to come back to the Stability and Growth Pact as quickly and as soon as possible. And I think this is very dangerous. And I just wondered whether you have any ideas how we can actually convince and convey this incredibly important message that precisely the human life, the well-being is much more important than the profit, the current economic push for growth and more growth. So if you have just a couple of ideas to impart, it would be really good.
I mean, I absolutely agree with you, and I think that moment in time at which that was suspended was incredibly important. Actually, interestingly, last year, at the beginning of last year, the European Economic and Social Committee passed an own opinion on the sustainable economy that we need, and one of the elements in that actually was the idea of shifting the Stability and Growth Pact being a sustainability and well-being pact. And there is out there, actually, from a couple of years ago, there's a petition across Europe to do exactly that, to reframe the institutions that lie at the heart of those particular spectacles through which we look at the economy, and such as the Stability and Growth Pact. And in some ways, I think, you know, it's almost at that level, and it's a difficult thing to do, because who, as ordinary European citizens, knows much, if anything, about the Stability and Growth Pact? It isn't that many people, but actually untangling those particular institutional ties that force us through a particular ideological lens is one of those things that we have to campaign and campaign and campaign on, and use the power of civil society to change those things that are chaining us to an outdated dogma. It's inside politics, as Aurore is doing, and as to some extent as the European Economic and Social Committee was doing, outside politics on the streets, if we can educate people enough to take on those tasks, petitions, letters, representations to politicians, they have some small impact over time, and it's never easy to say exactly when that tipping point is going to arise. But of course, it has to arise if the system is going to change, and that's what should motivate us to engage in that political process.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Now we have just 12 minutes left for questions and answers session. So I would like to come back to you, Grace. You started with a kind of individual versus collective. You were talking about that the market and the prices are not really a natural phenomenon that just occur. It is something that we have created. Sort of thinking further from there, and thinking sort of what kind of role the financialization is playing in all this. Knowing that we are in the middle of a big, not only economic crisis, but incredible health crisis. And there are many households who are really, really hurting and struggling, although statistically there are not so many jobs lost yet. But we know that the hours worked have gone down considerably already. So do you think that, for example, helicopter money could be a solution? Maybe you can just try to give a short reply.
Yeah, I think I can answer that question with respect to all the elements of that question with respect to the recent GameStop saga in the US. So if for any of you who haven't been following that, what's happened is that basically a bunch of people on the internet saw that hedge funds were shorting the stock of a particular company called GameStop, and they all decided that they were going to use their stimulus checks to, and often, you know, much more money than that, often their kind of life savings, to try and push up the price of that stock and execute a short squeeze on these hedge funds. And miraculously enough, it worked. These hedge funds came very close to kind of going under, particularly one. And at that point, trading was shut down, and we've seen the stock collapse again, and lots of people lose lots of money in recent years. I think this, on so many levels, gives us a kind of indication of why it is so important to understand and develop a kind of coherent approach to collective action with respect to, you know, any aim that you're pursuing with your organizing, whether you're talking about climate justice, economic justice, whatever, because there is a tendency to assume, and when I wrote about this, I said exactly this, that because we're living in an age where, you know, the systems in which we inhabit are so complex, so interrelated, it's hard to see power being exercised. It's hard to see the ways in which power is exercised over human beings, whether that's by corporations, by the state, by financial institutions. And so it becomes difficult to kind of continue to conceptualize yourself as part of a class, as part of a group, as part of, you know, a wider set of people, a collective, all of whom have an interest in transitioning to a different way of organizing the world. As a result, we get these kind of weird, skewed forms of collective action, like this GameStop initiative, which you know, aimed to basically kind of beat the finance sector in its own game, right? And of course, that doesn't work because you know, this was kind of an inversion of the kind of common sense logic. So the common sense logic in you know, neoclassical economics is that financial markets are efficient. They are efficient prices and allocators of capital, and, you know, the value of a particular equity reflects the likely future profitability of that company and some other considerations. Now, obviously, what we've seen in recent years with quantitative easing and all sorts of other things is the prices of many stocks diverge from their underlying values generally. So that has been a real challenge to the efficient market hypothesis, as has, you know, the GameStop saga, the financial crash, etc. So this was a kind of inversion of that, which is to say stock prices are just nothing, they're meaningless, we can push it up you know, to astronomical heights and execute this short squeeze, and that will be a real challenge to the power of finance. And yet, of course, the thing that was lacking in this analysis was a recognition of the structural power of financial institutions, their links with the state, and their ability to weigh in when stuff like this does happen to ensure that their interests are met. And of course, trading on that platform that those people were using was shut down. And ultimately, you know, the house ended up winning again, as tends to happen. So I think this speaks to that problem about how we conceptualize collective action, how we encourage people to act as a class, and the labor movement is obviously very, very important for ensuring that. I mean, I wrote in this piece that I did on this thing that the GameStop saga is a natural result of a kind of neoliberal ideology that tells people that they have no power as workers, so they should try to exercise it as owners instead, which I think is kind of profoundly wrong. Okay. And I worry about this. Sorry, I was getting to the. I was getting to the point there in a very roundabout way, which is why I worry about this idea of just giving people money, right? I think giving people money as part of a wider set of solutions that aim to give people a sense of their own power is potentially a good way out of this crisis. But if we're just distributing cash, like as was done in the US, and as all that money ended up largely going into financial markets without challenging underlying structures, without giving people a sense of their own agency, without doing something like universal basic services, right, which is decommodifying the things that people need to live, which does give you power because it gives you the power to be able to walk away. The power to be able to unionize is another thing. Then all we end up doing is just reinforcing the structures that gave rise to those problems in the first place.
Great, thank you very much. And I see, Anne, you wanted to come in, you wanted to react. But before you react, I also have another question to you. We talked about the Green New Deal, and you emphasize how important it is and its role. But have you ever thought about the need for a new social contract? So a new social deal.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, on the question of helicopter money, there is no such thing as helicopter money, and there never has been, right? All money is created as credit, as a promise to pay, as an obligation, as a bond. And that's how all money originates. And so there's no such thing as just printing money. Money is not printed. These are all obligations, promises to pay, repay in the future. So, the helicopter money was a Milton Friedman concept. It's completely flawed. It explains the failure of monetarism and so on. On the social contract, absolutely. And I think the social contract should be between the people and the masters of the world, basically. Right now, the masters of the world are not our governments. I just want to say there was a comment in the chat about how the conversation we're having is very highbrow and that actually, the people out there don't talk about this stuff. I think that is deeply flawed. People understand there is something fundamentally wrong with our governments. People understand that there are elites. People understand that some people, the 1%, are doing fantastically well out of this, and the rest of us, the 99%, are doing badly. People can see that. That's why 74 million people voted for Trump, because he argued he was going to tackle the elites. Never mind that it was wrong, that he's wrong, but that's what people understand. They understand there's something terribly wrong. So when, we then talk about the alliance between social democracy and capital and how we're going to maintain that power, people are not stupid. They can work it all out. They don't have to be Marxists. They don't have to be macroeconomists. They don't have to be monetary experts. They can see what you and I can see. And that's why they've rebelled. That's why they're so angry. And they are turning to strong men, invariably, to defend their interests against these globalized markets that are undermining their interests, their jobs, and so on and so forth. So definitely we need a new social contract. And I think, of course, what Grace has been saying is so important. It's about power. We have to understand, and we have to use our power in the interest of the majority in a social. And I think also what Tim has been saying is terribly important, which is that, the contract between the state and society must be that the state will care for you. When the pandemic hits, the state will care for you. In the case of the United States, the state says, no, don't worry, the pharmaceutical companies are going to care for you. And we are saying that. We're saying, don't worry, the pharmaceutical companies will provide the vaccine, right? And we're relying on them. And we're seeing how that's dividing societies across the world. Because, of course, the pharmaceutical companies cannot do that without the state. So I'm strongly in favor. And I think what Tim said was so important. And women, because he's absolutely right. The sector that mattered, that kept us alive during the pandemic, were not highly paid footballers or highly paid market players in the city of London and in Frankfurt. They were nurses, they were carers, they were key workers in the supermarkets. They were truck drivers delivering parcels and so on. These are the people that kept us alive, and we pay them very, very little. So fundamental to the new social contract should be the understanding that we value the work. And the good thing about, as Tim was stressing, the good thing about caring work is that it's less carbon intensive. It doesn't require extraction of the Earth's finite assets to care, to educate, to create music, to create beautiful things, to undertake works of art. These are the things that we should be doing. But the market isn't prepared to support that or to pay for that or to allow that to happen. So yeah, in answer to your question,
you.
definitely.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Grace. Indeed, just a small remark. In Belgium, when the nurses and the doctors were working overtime, there was a moment when they were allowed to pay reduced tax on their overtime pay, and then it disappeared. And of course, there was an uproar. It's horrendous. They are saving us. They are doing more than their duty, and then we tax them heavily. And then we have Amazon that has increased its profits incredibly during the pandemic. And where is the tax there? Where is the tax? Where is the money that they should be paying to the societies, to the countries where Amazon operates? But Aurore, that brings me to you, and the issues of regulation. How can we use regulation in these circumstances to try to get us into a better place, into a system that supports the care, supports the education, supports the environment? Can we do that through regulation?
Je pense qu'on peut le faire qu'à travers justement des réglementations. C'est-à-dire que comme ça a été parfaitement dit, le marché n'est pas capable de nous guider. Pendant des années, on a dit qu'à chaque fois qu'il y avait un problème, c'est parce qu'il n'y avait pas de prix finalement et que les acteurs étaient aveugles et ne savaient pas comment correctement placer leur argent. Si c'était vrai, on ne serait pas dans la situation actuelle. Donc en fait, il n'y a que face à l'urgence environnementale et l'urgence sociale, il n'y a que ça aujourd'hui qui peut nous aider, à mon sens. Il n'y a que l'État, les services publics et la réglementation, aussi parce qu'on a une demande de biens qui sont des biens communs et qui ne sont pas financés et qui ne sont pas finançables d'ailleurs par le marché. On a besoin de santé, ça a été parfaitement dit, on a besoin d'air pur, d'eau propre, etc. Et tout ça aujourd'hui n'est pas correctement financé. Donc oui, ça ne passera à mon avis que par la réglementation. Juste un exemple, le trou dans la couche d'ozone. Je ne sais pas si vous vous en rappelez, fin des années 80, début des années 90, trou dans la couche d'ozone. Est-ce que c'est le marché qui a pu réguler ça? Sûrement pas. On a eu un accord international, pour une fois, entre tous les pays du monde, et on a interdit les gaz. On a interdit les gaz. Je ne suis jamais favorable au système du pollueur-payeur, par exemple. Je suis favorable à des réglementations. Quand c'est pas bon, on interdit. Quand c'est bon, on autorise. Et aujourd'hui, il y a urgence à faire ça. Et je reviens rapidement sur la question sociale d'ailleurs. On est dans une situation aujourd'hui où ça a été parfaitement dit, finalement, on marche sur la tête et on n'a plus le sens des priorités. C'est-à-dire que les gens qui nous aident au quotidien, le secteur du care, etc., sont sous-payés. On est dans une zone euro qui nous dit investir dans notamment dans les services publics, dans l'éducation, dans la santé, ce n'est pas faire de l'économie sérieusement. Et il y a un besoin réel, à mon avis, de remettre un peu d'ordre, même beaucoup d'ordre, finalement, dans tout ça. Ce qui est terrible, c'est que ça sera uniquement, parce que vous parliez tout à l'heure d'éléments, comment on peut convaincre, mais on n'est pas dans l'ordre de convaincre, en fait. Tout le monde sait que le système actuel ne fonctionne pas et que les termes qui ont été utilisés d'un point de vue économique étaient des termes finalement pour faire peur aux citoyens et pour les empêcher de réclamer certaines choses. Voilà, tout simplement. À chaque fois que les citoyens proposaient des choses, on leur disait « ce serait bien, mais on ne peut pas ». Et à chaque fois, on leur expliquait que l'économie, ce n'était pas comme ça que ça se faisait, qu'il fallait rembourser la dette, etc., etc., pour justifier des politiques austéritaires. Et c'est ça aujourd'hui qu'il faut absolument changer. C'est pour ça qu'aussi, je partage parfaitement ce que Tim, Grace et Anne ont dit, c'est-à-dire qu'on va avoir besoin de rapports de force, il ne faut pas être naïf. Ce n'est pas une question de conviction, c'est une question de rapport de force et de mobilisation. Et je le dis cette fois-ci en tant que parlementaire européenne, on sait que le Parlement européen bouge beaucoup quand derrière il sent qu'il a une pression de la société civile. Et on l'a eu sur la question de la fiscalité, et on va encore en avoir besoin pour pouvoir faire bouger les lignes et financer cette transition écologique et sociale qui, en plus, pourra créer des emplois. Et je finis là-dessus, le faire avec les syndicats et avec les ONG, parce que ça ne peut pas se faire de manière descendante. On doit le faire tous ensemble.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Aurore. And I realized that I'm between your lunch and here, but I still would like to ask one last question to Tim. In your new book that is going to be published, Post-Growth Life After Capitalism, you almost dare us to imagine a world beyond capitalism. A place where relationships and meaning take precedence over profits and power. And I realize that my question may be a bit naive, but do you think that people are ready for such a pragmatic change? Or is it still the greed that is driving us, that we want more, we want better? Just if you can.
Yes, I mean, I think my position on that, and it's a little similar to the way I've been thinking about this conversation. Actually, is that we are looking for that intervention that will suddenly lead us to the change that we are beginning to realize we need in the market, and we're having to fight for that understanding of what that intervention is in a climate, in a culture, actually, that's systematically working against us. And so I do believe that we are ready for that change, because it's my fervent belief that that part of human nature that's coded into conventional economics, the selfish, rational man, usually, is in fact such a miscaricature of who we are, that it has done enormous damage, not just to the economy, but also to society itself. And what we've seen, I think, and beginning to see, in particular through all sorts of things that have happened in this last year, but have also happened since the financial crisis, we have begun to see those other parts of the human psyche, the care for other people, the concern for others, and indeed our ability sometimes to slow down rather than speed up. They are genuine parts of our psychological makeup, with evolutionary roots in the way that we evolved as human beings, and they are there in our nature. What the struggle is, it seems to me, it's it is a struggle, not quite in the traditional Marxist sense, because actually the damage capitalism has created has instigated a culture in which our own psychology has become damaged. So the struggle is partly about freeing ourselves from the wrong glasses, as Aurora would say. And it's also about allowing those conditions and sometimes fighting for those conditions that will allow others to free themselves as well. It's kind of, the struggle is dead. Long live the struggle.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to convey a great big thank you to Grace, Anne, Aurora and Tim for providing us with very interesting, thought-provoking and challenging ideas. I think, Anne, I have to rethink my job, because you say that dialogue is delusional. So I really have to rethink my job, because dialogue is the core, the part of my job. But that's a challenge for me. So thank you very much. And have all a good lunch. And please, if you are interested in the next session, it will start at 1:30. So bon appétit to all of us.